right. Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka. I'm the director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Iran's Arab Strategy and American Policy Options. In just 8 days, Iran will hold its presidential elections. By any standard, these elections should matter plenty since Iran is suffering from a long list of dire challenges. One of Iran's main economic challenges, as we all know plenty about, is linked to the many sanctions on that country. There are literally hundreds of sanctions on Iran. Some are linked to Iran's nuclear program, while others are linked to Iran's foreign policy actions and the violation of the human rights of the Iranian people. As Secretary of State Tony Blinken recently pointed out, many of these sanctions will remain even if there's a new nuclear deal emerging from the talks that are going on in Vienna. With sanctions costing Iran hundreds of billions of dollars in recent years alone, the question is whether Iran has a game plan to free itself from this situation. Any objective analyst will surely point out that to roll back the many sanctions, Tehran might have to reconsider some of its foreign policy choices, particularly those it has made in the Arab world, such as its support for militant Arab organizations like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the militias in Iraq or Syria. Certainly at the moment, there is no sign of such an introspection in Tehran. What we do know is that Iran's policy in the Arab world is controversial in Tehran, but also in the Arab world. So much so that the 7 candidates running for the presidency in Tehran right now don't even dare raising questions about what Iran is doing in the Arab world. What are the drivers behind Iran's actions in Arab countries? What does it mean for U.S.-Iran relations going forward, and for competition between the US and Iran in the Arab world specifically? And finally, what does it all mean for the Arab states? To discuss these matters, MEI is delighted to welcome 3 outstanding experts. In the interest of time, I will introduce them by name and affiliation only, but you can see their impressive bios on the page for this event available on the Middle East Institute website. First, we have Haneen Qadar, who is a Friedman Fellow at the Washington Institute here in DC. She focuses on Shia politics in the Levant. Next, we have Mohsen Sazegara, a prominent Iranian journalist and political activist who closely follows policy debates in Tehran. Last but not least, we have Nader Uskoui, a longtime advisor to the US Central Command, who closely follows Iranian actions in Arab countries and is the author of a new book called Temperature Rising, which focuses on Iran's use of proxy groups in the Arab world. Just a few pointers from me before we start. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking for your question and we'll factor in as many as I can. Without introduction, let me start off quickly going to Mohsen. Mohsen, I just this morning heard Hassan Rouhani say a bunch of kids did something stupid and ruined our chances of having good relations with our neighbors. I think he was specifically talking about Saudi Arabia. After 42 years, how can a bunch of kids ruin Iran's foreign policy? What's your reaction to something like that?
Can I talk a little bit about the background before answering this specific question? Thank you, Alex, for having us. As everybody knows that 2 main axes of Iran foreign policy during last 42 years is based on anti-US and elimination of Israel. All the actions and reactions of Iran foreign policy is attributed to these 2 main axes. Based on these 2 axes, which is regardless of the government changes in Iran, Rouhani or Khatami, Ahmadinejad, or Rafsanjani, or maybe Raisi the next, these 2 axes has not been changed. And to fulfill these to respond to necessities of these two axes, Iran has expanded a terrorist network from Kabul to Caracas. About 10,000 members of Quds Force are specifically concentrated on this matter, but more than 300,000 militia from other countries are in this network. Right now that we are talking, Ayatollah Khamenei needs money to feed this vast network. At least, as far as I know, at least he needs $7 billion, or better, he's looking for $15 billion to keep this network alive. He needs money for this network, not for the economy of Iran. Economy of Iran needs is now at one of the worst situations, 50% inflation rate almost, and minus 6.7 growth, GDP growth, economy growth, which has been continuously negative during the last few years. So the economy of Iran will not be healed by any money like that. He needs money for this network. And the other thing that I have to add as background is the opposition of the people. The last big demonstration happened in November 2019. 2,236 people were killed by the order of shoot to kill during just 4 days on November 2019. But that order was disobeyed by some members of IRGC, some members of Basij, and police of Iran. 127 members were arrested and imprisoned because of disobeying, of killing their own people. So for this reason, they imported, Qasem Soleimani on those days was alive, and he brought the Hashd Shabi forces and some forces from Zainabiyun and Hezbollah of Lebanon to Iran and killed the people. Estimation of the regime relies on 70,000 militia, non-Iranian militias from the region in case they need to suppress the people of Iran. This is one of the main concerns of this regime. So I mean that Khamenei needs to keep this vast terrorist organization, not only for the main concerns and axis of foreign policy, but on these days, more important, to suppress the people of Iran. The people who are hungry, angry, and sick because of mismanagement in Corona, and the evaluation of intelligence of Iran shows that if on November 2019, 280 cities of Iran, we had demonstration, average 1,000 people in every city, they evaluate that if this figure will be multiplied by 2, it means that more than 500 cities, every city 2,000 people, they are not able to control that. This is the reason that they are really concerned about the internal affairs in Iran on these days. For this reason, on these days, election in Iran, which have been 7 people have been handpicked by the leader, and as a show, at the end of the day, so far the decision is based on Raisi, the guy who is at the head of the judiciary power, and his background from the first day of victory of revolution so far. He was only 19 years old when he became prosecutor in Karaj, so far he has only one background in the Islamic Republic: killing the people, murdering the people, participation in massacre in Iran prisons on 1988, and he was at the head of judiciary power on November 2019. And why they tried to bring Raisi to power, because he's the guy that obeys Khamenei and his son Mojtaba without any question, and he's ready to kill. And this is the situation now in Iran. Now I can come to your question, that why Rouhani is talking about the foreign policy. As you know, Rouhani during last 8 years, he did nothing for the people of Iran. He's really, really unpopular right now, and he's leaving the office in a situation that is one of the worst situations of the country. He knows that he might be imprisoned after leaving the office, at least under somehow home arrest like Khatami. Some of his near colleagues already have been imprisoned, like his brother. And this is the reason that he tries to justify the situation and the defeat in foreign policy, like JCPOA, like in the region, normalization relationship with Saudi Arabia, and so and so. So he tries to say that that was not his fault. Mm-hmm. That was the fault of the hardliners. And actually, everybody knows that hardliner is just a nickname for the faction of Khamenei, his son, and the house of the leader. So he tries to, put the burden on Khamenei and blame them. But I don't think that it helps him to have any, popularity on the remaining days of his term.
Thank you, Mohsen. Wonderful, start here for our conversation. We'll come back to, I'm sure, a lot of the points you raised, particularly the issue of the sort of rivalry within Tehran over policymaking, including Iran's policies in the Arab world. Haneen, turning to you, for an American audience or Western audience, what does the average citizen sitting in Beirut, Damascus, Cairo, Riyadh, from your, following the Arab world, what do they make of these Iranian elections? Do they take it seriously? Do they think these elections might be a moment where, the Iranian state decides to go in a different direction, change its course towards the Arab world, or not? What is your sense?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for having me. I think that for anyone from Lebanon's perspective dealing with Iran via Hezbollah, or even people in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and everywhere in the Arab world, but mainly these states where Iran is very much powerful, I think people see Iran via the IRGC and Khamenei. They don't really look at internal Iranian politics in terms of elections. They don't understand the differences within the system and within the entities and institutions. And that's mainly because all they know about Iran is via Hezbollah and Qasem Soleimani. And Hezbollah is the IRGC, and Qasem Soleimani was the head of the IRGC. That's all they know. From Imad Mulnihi to Mustafa Badruddin to all Hezbollah's activities in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, everything they know is the IRGC. So their perspective towards Iran comes from this angle and this lens. So for someone living in Beirut or Syria or Iraq, the elections do not make any sense for them, simply because they see it as something that is purely Iranian and will never affect them, because it never has. since even like the reformists coming into power to others, to Rouhani, and even if Raisi comes now, it's not going to change anything, because at the end of the day, the people who are in charge of the region is not the president or any government institution in Iran, it's the IRGC. So it's not going to change anything. That's why they don't really care about it. Plus, if you look at the region today and the priorities of the region, it's one, what Iran really is doing in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, etc., through the IRGC and its proxies, that is Hezbollah. And the thing is that the deteriorating economic and social conditions, the upcoming social explosion in Lebanon, the harsh feeling of occupation that these people are living under is basically the priority today. There's so much happening in each of these countries that the Iranian elections seem very far from them, and no matter what happens, it's not going to affect them. So my short answer to this long talk is basically no one cares.
No one cares.
No one cares.
Thank you, Hanin. And again, I will come back to you, but let me just turn to Nader. Nader, your reaction to these Iranian presidential debates, the two of them. I don't know if you wanted to spend any time watching them. I had to, and I didn't get anything out of them, to be honest. There was no mention of foreign policy. But let's just say what Hanin said, and I largely agree with Hanin, that there's been a lot more consistency in terms of what Iran has done in the region, regardless of who's been sitting in the presidential palace. If that is true, that consistency from an American point of view, and I guess from a Western point of view, and the point of view of allies of the West in the region, how do you deal with that consistency that is coming from Iran? Because it must have worked for them, at least from their perspective, it must have worked for them. How do you deal with it?
Well, first of all, let me thank you and MEI for the invitation. It's so good to be on the same panel with my old colleagues, Mohsen and Hanin. The consistency can be explained, and the lack of attention of the presidential candidates to the foreign policy can be explained by the simple fact that Iran's strategy in the Arab world, Iran's Arab policy, is not a classic foreign policy. Mm-hmm. is not defined mainly as the government's strategy, Tehran's strategy in dealing with other governments. It's not even based on diplomacy. As the profession, as the skill of managing relations with the Arab capitals. Iran's foreign policy in the Arab world, the regional policy, if you will, has been really militarized from the beginning. Iran's Arab strategy is the policy in the Arab world is not even run by its Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's run by IRGC's Quds Force. Even major embassies in Arab capitals act as logistics centers, logistic supports for the Quds Force in those countries. And often their ambassadors are general officers of the Quds Force itself. So this is a military policy masqueraded as a foreign policy. Really, elections of the president, who is going to be president, will not have much effect on that, because the policy is run on the policy side is run by the Office of the Supreme Leader, and on operation side is run by the Quds Force in the Arab world. Mm-hmm. That's why you find consistency always, no matter who's the president, because the presidents consistently do not have any authority to deal with the Arab world.
Right. Thank you very much, Nader. I'm going to start early and have the first question, because it's sort of directed at you, Mohsen, and the question says, does Iran have the right to defend itself surrounded by hostile neighbors in the last 40 years? And I guess the question here, which I disagree with, because I would say if you go back to 1979, That's my personal view. But if you look at the hostage crisis, the manufactured crisis with the United States, that was the doing of Ayatollah Khomeini and his people. The Iran-Iraq war, they basically asked for war. They provoked Saddam for months and months. And so basically what we have here is this notion that Iran's forward defense, which is what we're talking about in the Arab world, is out of necessity to defend itself. But you don't look at the other side of the argument, which is that you wouldn't need a forward defense if you weren't meddling in some of these neighboring countries like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and so forth. But anyway, what is your reaction to the question here that Iran has to defend itself and being active in the Arab world is part of that defense?
My reaction is that, basically it's right. Every country has a right to defend itself, including Iran. But the definition of defending the country in the mindset of leaders of Iran is something else. They have presupposition. They think that they should fight with the United States and Israel, and they have invented a word which is the axis of resistance. When they say axis of resistance, they mean fighting with Israel, the allies to fight with Israel, elimination of Israel. And they have another hypothesis that the United States wants to overthrow the regime of Iran, so to eliminate Israel and to keep their regime in power, they should, have this vast network of terrorism based on asymmetric wars with the United States and fighting before offending before defense. This is the philosophy behind what they call it defense, which I agree with you. The basic is wrong. The United States was, if I'm not wrong, was the third country in the world that recognized Islamic Republic after victory of Islamic Revolution. And that was Iran who started hostage taking. And the crisis started with the United States. And Israel had an embassy in Iran before revolution. That was Iran that started fighting with Israel, and not only fighting with Israel, but supporting the hardliners, the most militant Palestinian organizations, and accused Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian moderates to be the agents of the United States. War between Iran and Iraq, I was several times in war fronts on those days. While we were defending the country, it took about 1 year and a half. I agree with you. There are now big questions on starting the war. Even if it was Saddam who invaded Iran first, or Iran provoked Saddam before that. But even if we agree that Saddam invaded Iran, it took 1 year and a half that we kicked out the enemy from our soil. But after that, 6 years and a half, the war continued. And by sacrificing more than 235 more lives, besides 230 lives at the first phase of the war, to attack to Iraq. And I remember the slogans on those days that to liberate Quds, they mean Israel when they say Quds, Jerusalem, we should first conquer Karbala. Right. We should occupy Iraq, then we go to Quds. That was the slogan for continuation of the war for 6 years and a half more. And it has been continued so far, I think. Right. So what Iran does is not based on defending the country, is not based on the benefit of Iranians. It's just based on, aggressive foreign policy based on wrong hypothesis.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mohsen. Hanin, look, I just wanted to ask you, you could make the argument that, the Iranian forward defense strategy of having proxies in the region has always depended on one thing, which is that somebody somewhere in the region has to mess up first, that there are masters of filling up vacuum, that their ideology isn't necessarily that attractive. They don't have that money either, but that they can come to the aid of entities in the region that are desperate for somebody to hold their hand. I mean, I think the last example are the Houthis of Yemen. So what about that? I mean, what do you, I mean, I guess I want to ask you to sort of maybe give us some, not a policy recommendation, but if you are Washington and this is how Iran has operated, looked for vacuums and skillfully tapped into those vacuums, how do you prevent more pockets in the Arab world from wanting to look to a country like Iran for sponsorship, if you will?
Yeah, this is very,
that was for Hanin. I'll come back to you. Sorry.
I can answer in only one question. The dictators understand the language of force only. This is the only language that they understand.
Okay.
And I think that if you want to stop Khamenei and his son, dictators of Iran, you should show the teeth to them. You should show force. That's it. Otherwise, they don't stop.
Hanin, your reaction?
Yeah. All right, that's okay. Thanks, Mohsen. I do agree. I definitely do agree with Mohsen, but obviously this is not going to happen. And we have seen in the past incidents where Iran how Iran responded to force and how Iran responded to diplomacy. And obviously they lie, right? So they definitely pretend that they are going to make a deal or accept diplomacy and act like a state in the region. They do not. They definitely respond better to force. I agree. However, talking about that, they will not today. They do know that this is not going to happen. The only people who are actually using force against Iran's proxies are the Israelis, and only in certain places, that is Syria. We know that this is not going to happen in terms of a unified military force against Iran itself, the IRGC, or its proxies in the region. This is not going to happen. Diplomacy is the way, and we have to deal with that. So that being said, let me just say something that I think it's very important at this point. Today, these people, and I'm talking about from the perspective of how I see Hezbollah reacting in Lebanon, I'm sure everyone in the region is reacting the same. Hezbollah at the very beginning, yes, they filled a vacuum in the sense that they came in when there was an Israeli occupation, but that was not. That was a tool. The resistance of Hezbollah was a tool towards hegemony, and we see this today because resistance is dead. The main reason why they came with this resistance rhetoric in Lebanon is because people were starting to get fed up with the Israeli presence in Lebanon. So they came and they said, "I will liberate you, I will protect you, but I also will provide for you." So they came as a father figure, and they replaced the state very gradually. The state was already weak, going through a civil war. The Shia has historically been abandoned by the state compared to other communities in Lebanon. So there was a vacuum there. They replaced not just international powers or international communities' efforts in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq, they actually replaced the state. And that's the most dangerous part, because if you look at Lebanon, it's not like they came to save Lebanon from a vacuum or a danger that is external. The whole resisting Israel was one part of it, but they actually came to replace the state. They started with the Shia community, presenting themselves as a father figure, the protector and the provider to the Shia community, and then they took over gradually the state. So if you look at today, what's happening in Lebanon today, Hezbollah has moved from being the state within the state to actually Lebanon becoming a tiny entity within Hezbollah state and eventually Iran state. So it is a very non-traditional kind of occupation of Lebanon, of Syria, of Iraq. it is not the same occupation that we are used to, like the Syrian hegemony, let's say, or the Israeli occupation of the South at one point, or the French mandate, or historically, you know, like Lebanon and the region went through so many occupations. This is a very clear occupation for many people, but it's a non-traditional kind of occupation where they come as Lebanese. Hezbollah, at the end of the day, they say we are Lebanese, but are they? We all know, despite all the rhetoric that we hear in Western states that, you know, like Hezbollah has this room of maneuver, that Hezbollah is actually not necessarily part of Iran's IRGC. They are a party supported by Iran or built by Iran, but they have their own independence. It's not true. Hassan Nasrallah himself said it many times that Hezbollah is part of the IRGC, that he is actually a small soldier in Wilayat al-Faqih. And if you think about the way they react in the region, if they really were independent, why would they go to Yemen? Why would they go and fight in Aleppo in Syria? This is really in the small indications of how they actually function. It's not about Lebanon, it's not about them. So they come, present themselves as, you know, like the most powerful party in Lebanon, take over the state, and it becomes a proxy occupation, you know? So this is how they come. So this is technology. Yes, they fill gaps like they did in many parts of the Arab world, but they fill the gap of the state. So this is where I think one of my recommendations comes based on this. It's not just to use force, but also to make sure that the people have the alternative in terms of either state institutions or other alternatives to Hezbollah, because in Lebanon today, forget about the state. State institutions are gone completely. In Syria as well, right? So it's to rebuild the state and to revamp the state institutions is going to take years and years, decades actually. So, but at the same time, there are other alternatives that Hezbollah filled. He's not just the protector; he's also the provider. And today, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran in the region, as Mohsen said earlier, they want the money. They don't have the money. Lebanon is collapsing. Syria is collapsing. You know, the financial crisis is harsh, but they are going through their same financial crisis. The ideal scenario today for them is for the US and Iran to sign a deal, reach a deal. Sanctions will be lifted. Some sanctions will be lifted. Iran will regain access to hard currency, which means that Hezbollah will regain access to hard currency. Their own financial crisis is not because of Lebanon's crisis or even, you know, sanctions against Hezbollah itself. They have cash economy. Their main crisis today is Iran's crisis, and this is the main organic link between them and Iran. They are going through really, really tough times, and all the efforts that would mask their abuse of the state institutions in Lebanon are no longer there. The mask is lifted. It's very clear. Like 2 days ago, Hassan Nasrallah came out and said, I will go to Iran and negotiate and get the fuel. And then he said something very clear, you know, like whoever can stop me, they can try. Whoever wants to stop me, they can try. He makes the decisions. He said no to early elections. He said no to resignation. He said no to everything. The decision was made in Iran. He just conveyed it to the Lebanese, right? So if you look at all that, the context of this, how these proxies are working today, they are exposed, and exposing them goes a long way, a long way. They are exposed because they're no longer the protector and they're no longer the provider. The father figure has collapsed because of the financial crisis and because of exposing them through corruption deals and protecting corrupt institutions. Exposing them goes a long way, right? So in a way, the Shia today, but also the Lebanese in general, but specifically the Shia community, looks at Hezbollah very differently.
Right.
They lost a father figure and they want another father figure, which is not going to be Iran anymore. But do they have a choice today? No. That's why we have to look at this as something, a space, a golden opportunity to provide alternatives, and not political alternatives, not another party, not another Shia leader, not another traditional sort of alternative that would replace March 14 versus Hezbollah. No, this is all gone. The people today are looking at themselves through different lenses. The collapsing. And the only alternative that can actually attract a huge number of people who are feeling this vacuum before Hezbollah comes back with money and fills it is the economic alternative.
Mm-hmm.
Really economic alternative, and the private sector. Really, that's it. So this is the only way that this can work in Lebanon, and there will be something coming up soon about this from the Washington Institute. I'm working on it, but it's for me, this is the simple fact that really would work. Another thing is the exposure, the disinformation. There are so many things that can do. Continue strengthening some institutions that still have some kind of independence in Lebanon, but this is really the long term. Right. There are short term and long term. In the region, make sure that if Iran really gets back the access to hard currency, that there is a policy, despite the deal, that there is a policy, a regional policy, but also country by country policy focused on these proxies. That even if Iran will be able to send them the money, make sure that they will not be able to use the money in that way. Right. That's my main recommendation. But this needs to be addressed.
No, thank you, Haneen. Staying on that issue of policies for Washington, Nader, I was wondering, like as Haneen just beautifully described, when you look at Iran's relations with proxy organizations out there, you got the very intimate relations. Hezbollah is probably the most intimate relationship that they have going back to 1979. And then you got these latecomers of the last decade or so. The Houthis in Yemen are probably the best, where the relations are not that strong. It's much more pragmatic. We don't even really know if the Houthis listen to Tehran when Tehran wants them to listen, which makes me want to ask this question of you. How smart is Washington's policy in terms of separating the various files? So to Haneen's point, how do you can choose to tackle all of it in one go. I think, that was probably best articulated in Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which was, to go after everything in one go. It didn't really result in what had been intended. So why not just go piecemeal, small steps, choose the file where you have the best chance of pushing back against Iran in the region? Would that not be a better way forward?
Our action is actually dictated by what Iran does in the region. So we have to see what their policies are. Haneen talked in detail about what Iran does in Lebanon. That's not for national defense, or that's not even for forward defense. That's a naked intervention, military intervention in a foreign country by building a parallel military parallel to the country's own national military. One more example like that is Iraq. And by the way, Yemen is also follows on into that. In Iraq, the heart of Iran's policy is building a confederation, if you will, of armed groups in parallel and in a lot of instances in competition with the Iraqi National Army. The principal mission of these groups are not fighting enemies of Iraq. The principal mission of these groups these days are launching attacks on US interests and US personnel, even use them to launch attacks from Iraqi soils on Saudi and UAE interests. So this is not the case that Iran is defending itself by staying in Iraq as a forward defense. It's not. It's a naked aggression, is a naked intervention. As a matter of fact, I argue that Iran's Arab strategy is built around military intervention. Now, what do we do? Let me mention quickly about Houthis. Iran's relation with Houthis is very old. As a matter of fact, it's older than with Hezbollah, is older than with all Iraqi Shia militias. Iran's relations with Houthis goes back to the first few days of the revolution, when the Houthi leaders came to Tehran to congratulate Khomeini on his ascent. And from there on, always throughout these years, Iran has been supplying Houthis with arms and with training and with advisors without any interruption. Right now, of course, is a maximum things they do. They're using Houthis exactly like what they're using Iraqi Shia militias or Hezbollah in Lebanon, not to defend Yemen, but to have them launch aggression against our interests here and against interests of our allies. Really, how we are approaching it is that, okay, we have a region that Iran is interfering militarily in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, for that matter. And do we have to watch all of them? Of course we do. Is some of them more immediate, tactically more immediate, needs more immediate attention? Of course. And I think these days, my main worry are the Shia militias in Iraq.
Right. Thank you, Nader. Mohsen, turning to you, and I just wanted to ask you, maybe tell us what you sense is going on in terms of the policymaking process in Tehran on the issue of what Iran is doing in the Arab world. I mean, what Haneen and Nader described here just now is basically an Iranian imperialist agenda, perhaps veiled around this notion of, Vilayat al-Faqih or Islamism, but deep down, perhaps there is something Persian nationalist behind it. I disagree with it in the sense that I don't think Iranians want to do this. The average Iranian doesn't want to be involved in the region. But maybe that's not true. Maybe I've been out of Iran too long, and maybe that is what resonates with a lot of Iranians in Iran, that we need to be in the region, that who is the United States to come from 7,000 miles away and tell us what we can do in the region? This is our region. We have an entitled a right to be in all these countries that Nader mentioned, from Lebanon to Afghanistan. But really, is there much of a debate? Because you don't get that sense when you listen to the so-called presidential debate, certainly. But we know Iran has hundreds of universities, thousands of very smart people in academia who are publishing all the time on various issues. Where are those voices? What is your sense? Or is this really just a small group of people like Qasem Soleimani and a bunch of other people when he was around, and now it's Rouhani, who at the Quds Force level are basically deciding everything, and the rest of the country has to pay the price for their actions?
Before answering this question, I ask for your permission to add a quick description to previous question. When I said that the dictators understand the language of force only, I didn't mean military strike or military conflict, armed conflict between, for instance, the US or Iran. No, I disagree with anyone, but I mean that when you talk to dictators, you should say it should be, and use all forces. I mean, especially economic forces, for instance, and any flexibility in front of the dictators, give the land to them to come ahead, come further, and be more aggressive. This is what I mean. From this point of view, I think that maximum pressure policy of President Trump did not succeed to bring Iran to negotiation table for nuclear issue. I knew that, but it was successful to fasten the hands of Iran in the region. This is why now they are ready to come to negotiation table and seeking for money, $70 billion, almost around $70 billion reserves of Iran is needed by Khamenei, as I said, to support this terrorist network or proxy groups. Now, going back to your question about the Iranian people, where are the middle class which don't like this regime? Where is the lower class that came to the street on November 2019? First of all, I have to say that this propaganda of regime that tries to say that whatever we do in the region is to revive the Persian Empire. This is just the face. Shiism or Shia crescent is just another name for Persian Empire. Especially, they had the propaganda around Qasem Soleimani. He's one of the big generals, like ancient generals of Persian Empire. They have worked on this campaign very much. I can say, unfortunately, some radical nationalists bought this idea for a while, but not now. Because and then Qasem Soleimani was killed by the US, and the situation of economy got worse and worse in Iran. Now it doesn't work anymore. Everybody says, even the radical nationalists say that we can't afford the bread, take the bread for the cloth of the people. So what we are talking about? I think that this propaganda doesn't work anymore. And I mean, the people of Iran now are in a situation that don't buy the ideology of regime anymore. Nobody believes, not only amongst the people, but even inside the regime, the inner circles of regime. Nobody believes in the ideology of velayat faqih and the religious utopia that we had, my generation, at the first days of revolution, anti-US, anti-capitalism, changing the world. They were the main ideas of a revolution. Now we have just a regime that there are some mafia gangs. They are really corrupted. Corruption is everywhere, from House of the Leader to IRGC to every part of Iran. And the poor people that, regardless of their situation in the society, I mean, unemployed workers, the working class, middle class, everybody is now have the average wage of $220 per month. And this is the situation that everybody is angry. Everybody is now thinking about this big item, that this regime can't solve the problem anymore. Any problem, not only economy, but the environmental problems, but the internal policies, addiction, drugs, many big problems in Iran are unsolved. So everybody is looking for change. Why they don't come to streets for protests? This is a big question. Why this regime is not going to be overthrown by the people? It will later soon. I believe so. But it depends on some factors. For instance, make the long story short, this regime is based right now on two pillars: propaganda machine, suppression machine. These two pillars are still working for this regime, especially suppression machine. Iran has more than 180,000 members of intelligence organizations that are watching the people. Amongst them are more than 4,000 interrogators, better to say torturers in Iran prisons. More than 240,000 prisoners all around the country, 6 times more than the capacity of Iran prisons. This machine still work for the regime to keep the people. This is the reason that in this election, they don't want to bring the people for voting, because they are afraid of a repeat of green movement, something like that again. So they prefer to have a person like Raisi at the top of the government that show the teeth to the people that we are killing. Regime is intolerable than before now. Arrest easily by any excuse the activists. So good news is that this suppression machine, this inner circle of the regime, is now has big cracks inside.
Right.
Disloyalty is the main problem of this regime now. So I can say that we will have a long and hot summer coming to Iran. This summer, you may hear some big news from Iran.
Right, right. Thank you, Mohsen. We have about 8 minutes left, and I apologize in advance for the hard sort of end to our conversation, just 2 minutes to the hour. But Haneen, let me, a question came in, and I'm going to summarize very quickly one bit of the question. Will Iran ever dare attack Israel beyond nibbling at the edges? Which really takes us nicely to the issue of Israel and how the Islamic Republic of Iran has since 1979 tried to mobilize the so-called Arab street by using the Israel card. And I just wonder, I mean, you obviously answer in any way you wish, but tell us also what happened in following the 11-day war just recently. The Iranians were very excited, the Iranian regime, I should say, was very excited, because it proved them right to Mohsen's point that axis of resistance is the only way forward against Israel, as opposed to what had happened just a few weeks earlier with the Abraham Accords, which is the idea of coexistence with Israel and compromise. What do you think of that? How is Iran playing the Israel card?
It's very interesting that you mentioned the recent war, because so yes, Iran, Hezbollah, all these people are in a real dilemma today, right? The resistance is dead and they need to revive it. So this war was a good way for them to revive the resistance to a certain extent, of course, maybe regionally more than locally, because the Lebanese have their own issues now, and they see the enemy is inside. You know, it's the enemy is within today. It's still outside. Israel is not a friend to the Lebanese. You know, I'm not saying the Lebanese people today like just suddenly are happy with Israel. This is not happening today or tomorrow, but they realize the real issue actually is more internal. So Hezbollah is really in a dilemma that they really want to revive the resistance, but they cannot activate the resistance. They want the rhetoric to be revived. So this was perfect for them in the sense that the resistance rhetoric is revived. They can talk more about it. They can show what Hamas did and the Iranians, but at the same time, they can't do anything about it. It's very clear that it was very clear for Hezbollah that when one of their guys was killed at the border, Tehran, shot by the Israelis, they made it very clear. They called, they forbid their supporters, their members, and anyone within their ranks to go to the border. This is the first thing they did. They coordinated with the army and the security institutions to make sure that no one goes to the border. And 3, they coordinated with the Palestinian factions in Lebanon to make sure that all the convoys that were going to the border do not reach there en masse, basically, because they know that this friction might lead to a war and they're not ready for a war. It's not saying that they don't want to start a war with Israel. This is something that they would do eventually, but today they're trying to calculate every step in the sense that the region is their priority today, not the resistance. Regional hegemony is number 1 priority. Israel comes second, not because they really want to start a war with Israel, but they really need the resistance rhetoric to be revived. And they need people to see them again as resistance. They really are desperate for that. When they get back the money that they used to get, when they are more comfortable financially, recruiting will come back, and it will be cheaper because of the amount of the dollars. The value of the dollar in Lebanon today is much, much higher. It moved from $1,500 to today we're reaching $15,000. So 15,000 lira, I mean. So the dollar is very expensive today. So any dollar they will get from Iran is really 10 times stronger, and its value is 10 times than it was before the sanctions. So this is also something that we need to understand. What Hezbollah can do with the US dollar today is 10 times stronger. It has 10 times more value. So they will be able to do better recruiting. They will be able to revamp their fighting force, which has suffered drastically. Their fighting force suffered drastically during the last 10 years. And it's not because they have lost people. It's basically because the fighting force is not united anymore. They have the old guys, they have the new guys, they have the recruits, like the part-timers, they have the full-timers, they have the ideological, they have the non-ideological. It's just so divided, and the friction within the fighting force itself. Some people are still getting paid in dollars, the contractors are not. So within Hezbollah's fighting force, there are frictions, there are tensions. So they need to take care of that first.
Right.
They need to take care of revamp their weaponry. It's just all over the place today. Some of it has expired, some of it needs more work. They need to make sure that they can actually provide compensations for people if they go to war. There will be some kind of reconstruction.
Right.
Not their own, that they will never reconstruct. They will get like Qatar to reconstruct, probably, right? They will guarantee reconstruction. Then they will go to war. Until then, they will avoid anything that would lead to war, anything, and focus on their own main priority. Every dollar they have today, they're spending it on the region, not on that. So that's the Israeli factor. Meanwhile, Israel is taking care of some of their infrastructure that are dangerous in terms of the precision missiles. I want to mention the precision missiles because this is really a very, the only thing that might actually disrupt the strategy, because if they are close enough to produce precision missiles, and I think Nader would know a little bit about this here, Israel will strike Lebanon.
Right.
They made it very clear that this is a red line. So that's why this is a very thin line that they're walking today. And this is where I think the war will start.
Okay. Thank you, Haneen. I'm so sorry to do this to you, Nader. We have literally just about a minute left. And my final question for you was this. After 42 years of the Islamic Republic, what do they have to show for their Arab strategy? Look, the Shah of Iran did all sorts of things in the Arab world too, from Yemen to Oman to Lebanon to Syria, but nothing like this, nothing like what the Islamic Republic has done, being willing to invest so much at such a high cost. So what do you think 42 years later?
The problem is that they militarized that strategy. The heart of their strategy in the Middle East was the use of military force, being proxies or being direct Iranian military forces. Just in this half a minute left, because of the militarization policy of Iran, of course, US has a robust military presence in the region, but we should be very careful that we need the support of the Iranian people if we are going to be successful in our policy. We cannot tell the Iranian people that we are going to force the regime on its knees to accept our terms, because then we lose their support. If we show that we do have the might, we do have the military presence, and we are ready to give off-ramps to the regime, so they can replace their military belligerent policies in Middle East with another policy that would be beneficial to them internally, economically, and all of that, then we might have, and I'm sure we will have, the support of the Iranian people. That's an important point to consider.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nader. Thank you, Haneen. Thank you, Mohsen. There's Mohsen, is back. I'm so sorry, particularly Nader, I gave you almost no time at the end, but you have to come back. There's so much more to discuss. I want to thank all three of our guests this morning for wonderful insights they gave us. Thank you to the audience for joining us, for your wonderful questions.
Thank you for having us.
Come back soon so we can have another panel on this very important topic. Have a wonderful